The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, the oppressive weight of the industrial complex pressing down on every corner. Deep beneath the surface of a forgotten planet, far from the bustling civilizations of the galaxy, a solitary figure sat chained to the cold, unforgiving wall. She wasn't human, not even close. Her features, though delicate and sharp, were foreign and exotic beauty that belonged to a race far beyond the reach of Earth's stars. Yet there was something about her, something profoundly human in the depths of her tired eyes. She had been abandoned, betrayed by her own kind, and in this desolate place, it seemed that no one would come to her rescue. The sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors of the facility, distant yet unmistakable. A part of her wondered if it was just another dream, another cruel trick her mind was playing on her. But then, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. They weren't like the heavy, mechanical steps of the guards who had chained her here, nor the calculated movements of her alien captors. This was different. A human was approaching. She could sense it. Her mind raced. Why had they abandoned her here, in this forsaken place, with only memories of a life she no longer recognized? The mission had gone wrong. They'd gotten too close to the humans, too close to their determination, their fearlessness, and their strange, powerful will to survive. And now, here she was, a prisoner in a world she didn't understand, betrayed by those she had once called allies. Her companions, her people, had left her behind, as if her life meant nothing to them. They had been willing to do anything to escape the human world, and she was a liability they couldn't afford. Her chains rattled as she tried to adjust her position, feeling the bite of the cold metal against her skin. There were no windows, no light except for the faint glow of a dying monitor, the buzzing of broken machinery above her head. There was no escape from this dark, suffocating place. She had learned to be patient, to survive the silence and the darkness. But that patience had worn thin. The isolation had cracked her resolve. She had no hope left, or at least she hadn't until now. The human appeared from the shadows, stepping cautiously into view. His face was young, but hard, a kind of determination in his eyes that told her this was no ordinary man. He looked nothing like the others she had seen before, brash, fearless, perhaps even a little reckless, but there was a fire in him. The same fire that burned in her, though she had long since tried to suppress it. He studied her carefully, his eyes scanning the chains that bound her to the wall, the bruises on her skin, the hollow look in her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the air was palpable. She was a stranger to him, an alien, someone from a world that had no place on Earth, yet here they were. She could see the hesitation in his posture. He wasn't sure what to make of her, of the situation. She had been locked away for so long, forgotten, left to rot in the dark. And now, a human stood before her, the very species that had been the cause of her misery. She was supposed to be their enemy, wasn't she? She'd been trained to view humans as weak, primitive beings. But now, staring into his eyes, she wasn't so sure. He took a step forward. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice soft but strong. The sincerity in his words cut through the tension like a knife. "I don't know what they did to you, or why they left you here, but I can help you." She could feel the weight of his words, though she didn't fully understand them. Help her? How could anyone help her now? She had seen the cruelty of her own people, their ruthless pragmatism. They didn't care about her. They hadn't even tried to reach out. They had left her to die. Yet here, this human stood, a stranger who had no reason to care, offering help. The human moved closer, kneeling in front of her. He reached for the chains around her wrists, the tools of her captivity, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The touch felt strangely comforting, but she recoiled instinctively. She had been betrayed by her own kind. What could this human do for her? But he didn't back away. Instead, he studied her with empathy, with understanding. "I'm not going to hurt you," he repeated, more gently this time. "I'm going to set you free." Her mind raced. Freedom. Could she really trust him? What if this was another trap, another layer to the deception that had already cost her so much? The pain in her heart, the weight of abandonment, made her wary. Yet there was something in his eyes, something that seemed so human. Something she had almost forgotten existed. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the wave of emotion that threatened to rise up. Could she allow herself to believe in the possibility of freedom again? Could she trust this human when everything else in her life had been a lie? He pulled a small device from his belt and began working on the lock that held her shackled. She watched in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. Her alien physiology had adapted to this world's atmosphere, but even with the changes, she had never fully understood humans. They were unpredictable. But perhaps that was their strength. The chains fell away with a soft click, and she instinctively flexed her fingers, feeling the freedom of movement again. The chains that had held her for so long were gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe without the weight of captivity on her chest. Her eyes locked with his once more. Why? The question was simple, but the weight of it was immense. Why was he helping her? Why would he risk his life for a creature like her? He stood up, holding his hand out to her. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You don't deserve to be here. No one does." The words seemed to echo in the stillness of the room, the silence so complete that it felt as though time itself had frozen. The chains that had bound her, the cruel hands of her companions, the isolation, all of it had been stripped away, but in its place stood an unsettling emptiness. The human's offer was genuine, but she didn't know what to do with it. Could she follow him? Could she trust him to guide her out of this nightmare? Her gaze flickered towards the door, beyond the dim walls of her prison, where an uncertain future waited. She wasn't sure if she could escape. She wasn't sure if anyone could survive what lay beyond this place. But with him standing there, offering her a chance, just a chance to break free, for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe. But what if this was a trick? What if she couldn't trust him? Before she could make a decision, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, sharper this time. Someone else was coming, and they were not friendly. The human looked at her, his expression hardening. The moment of choice had arrived, but would they escape in time? As the first blast rang out, the choice was no longer hers to make. The sudden sound of the blast echoed through the walls of the facility, rattling the metal structures and sending a wave of panic through both of them. The human jerked back, instinctively shielding the alien girl with his body, his eyes darting toward the sound. She tensed, every muscle coiled like a spring, ready to react to any threat. Her heart raced, and for a moment, her thoughts were nothing but a blur of adrenaline and fear. But there was no time to think. Not now. The blast wasn't just a random explosion. It was a warning shot. Someone had found them, and whoever they weren't here for a friendly conversation. "Stay down," the human whispered urgently. moving quickly to grab her by the arm and pull her toward the far corner of the room. The sound of boots pounding on the metal floors grew louder. The human didn't hesitate, pushing her against the cold wall as he positioned himself in front of her. His eyes were wild with urgency, scanning every shadow, every corner, anticipating the worst. But it was clear that neither of them was prepared for what was coming next. The blast had triggered the facility's alarms, and now the walls were vibrating with the harsh wail of sirens, a sound that only deepened the sense of imminent danger. They had moments, perhaps less, to act before they would be swarmed. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, her alien instincts kicking in, but the strange sense of humanity that had formed in her during these last moments of captivity was pulling her in a different direction. The human didn't see her as a monster. He didn't fear her. He wasn't shaking in his boots, like so many others had when they realized who she was. That was new. She had once been the one who had the upper hand. She had been a part of a proud, powerful race, dispatched by her people to monitor, to gather information, to conquer. But something had changed along the way. Her people had grown too cautious, too arrogant. The humans were proving to be more than just a nuisance. They had thrown her off balance, stolen something from her, something she wasn't ready to admit. Perhaps it was respect. Or maybe the realization that her people were not as invincible as they had thought. The human in front of her, the one who had spoken of freedom, didn't seem to care about her alien origins. He didn't see her as a threat. Her fingers clenched. She had been taught to distrust all humans. They were unpredictable, easily manipulated. But now, staring at the back of the human as he scanned the corridor, she found herself questioning everything she had been told. Could there be more to them than what her people had believed? A soft hiss from the control panel beside them snapped her out of her thoughts. The door was sliding open. "Stay close," the human murmured, his voice low, determined. He tugged her along, pulling her toward the opening door, just as the first set of heavy footsteps reached the hallway outside. She barely had time to react before they were slipping through the crack into the unknown. They darted down another corridor, barely making a sound. The alien girl's heart beat like a drum, the rush of blood ringing in her ears as they ran. Every corner, every shadow, a potential threat. The human moved with a quiet, practiced ease that told her he had been in situations like this before. She couldn't help but wonder how many times he had fought for his life in a place like this. His confidence was unnerving yet reassuring. With every turn they took, the hallways seemed to narrow, the lighting dimming until they were running through near darkness. Every step seemed to bring them closer to some kind of unknown conclusion, though neither of them had any idea where they were headed. The hum of the facility's power grid seemed to hum louder now, its vibration coursing through the walls through their feet. It was almost as if the entire structure was alive, reacting to their every move. The human stopped suddenly, gripping her arm to halt her. His eyes flicked toward a doorway ahead. Two shadowy figures in military garb stood guard. His face hardened. "We don't have much time," he muttered, turning to face her. "They'll be on us in minutes. I don't know how much longer I can keep you safe if they catch us." She nodded silently, her pulse racing. She was ready for whatever came next, though she didn't entirely understand how this human planned to get them out of here. His confidence was both a strength and a mystery to her. How was it that he seemed so sure of himself in this situation when she had no idea how to get them both to safety? He didn't wait for her response, his hand already moving to the small device he had used earlier to free her. The sleek, alien-looking object hummed to life in his grip, its surface glowing faintly. She couldn't help but be curious. How had he come to have such a tool, something so advanced? Was it his own, or had it been taken from the facility? Before she could ask, he moved toward the control panel beside the door, quickly bypassing the security code and unlocking the system with ease. She watched in silence, awe creeping into her mind. Who was this man, really? Was he just some random human, or was there more to his story than met the eye? The door slid open just as another blast echoed down the hall. A warning. They were running out of time. The human pulled her forward, and they slipped into a small room filled with crates and old equipment. There was a faint glow of light from a control panel in the corner, but it wasn't enough to see much else. The air was thick with dust, the smell of stale air and metal. They crouched in the shadows, waiting, their breaths shallow and quick. The girl's mind was racing. She had no idea where this would lead, or what she had gotten herself into by trusting this human. But one thing was certain, there was no going back. She had been abandoned by her own people, left for dead. She had been used and discarded like an object. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt something stirring inside her, a spark of hope, of rebellion. Could this human be her salvation, or would he ultimately betray her as well? The tension between them was palpable, but there was no time to question it now. They heard the guards approach. The door to the storage room was beginning to slide shut. "Ready?" the human whispered. She nodded. The door slammed shut, and the quiet was broken by the sound of heavy boots stomping in the hallway. The seconds dragged by, each one stretching longer than the last. The storage room was suffocatingly silent, except for the soft hum of machinery and the rapid, shallow breaths that escaped the girl and the human. They were crouched low, hidden in the shadows of the crates, as the sound of the guards grew louder. Closer. The human's face was tense, his eyes locked on the door, his body still as a statue. He didn't move, didn't even blink, but his hand gripped hers tighter, as if his life depended on it. And in this moment, perhaps it did. She could feel the intensity of his focus, the weight of his determination. There was no turning back now. Through the faint cracks in the door, she could see the shadows of the guards moving back and forth just outside. She could hear their muffled voices, but the words were indistinct, too distant to make out. Her mind raced, analyzing every option, every possibility, but there was no perfect solution. They couldn't stay here much longer. If the guards came inside, if they discovered them. She flinched as a loud bang echoed through the hallway outside, followed by a few harsh words. The guards were getting restless. She could hear the unmistakable clatter of weapons being checked, the metallic clink of gear. It was only a matter of time before they found the trail, the open door, the disturbed equipment, and when they did, there would be no escaping. The human's voice was a harsh whisper. "We need to move now." She nodded, her body already tense and ready for whatever came next. The air felt thick, the tension so heavy she could almost taste it. But there was a problem. She didn't know the layout of the facility well enough to predict where they were going. She didn't know where the exit was, where they could hide, or how to get past the countless security measures scattered throughout the place. She had been locked away for too long to trust her instincts here. The human must sensed her hesitation because his voice softened, just for a moment. "Trust me," he said, his eyes locked onto hers, the same fire in them that had drawn her in when they first met. "We'll make it." But his confidence only added to the pressure. Could she trust him? The decision seemed impossible. Yet, she had no choice but to follow. The guards were getting closer, and if they were found now, everything would be over. The human pulled her gently but urgently toward the far corner of the room. keeping low, keeping quiet. She didn't question his movements. He knew what he was doing. They made their way along the perimeter, moving between crates and machinery, slipping through the narrow spaces in between. The humans' every step was calculated, every decision precise, and yet the quiet wasn't enough. They had to get out of here before. A soft creak. The door to the storage room had shifted ever so slightly, just enough to let a sliver of light spill into the dark. The human froze, his breath hitching in his chest. The girl's heart skipped a beat. The guards were near, so close they could be standing right outside. She could hear their boots again, and this time they sounded like they were right at the door. The pounding of her own heartbeat drowned out all other sounds. The rhythm faster than ever, as if she were on the verge of something irreversible. The human's grip on her tightened, and he gestured for her to stay still. The seconds felt like hours. Every little noise, every shuffle of their clothes, every breath they took felt deafening in the oppressive silence. They couldn't make a sound. Not even the slightest movement could betray them. Then, a voice. It was one of the guards, and this time she could understand the words. "Did you hear that? In here?" The human's hand went to the small device at his belt again. He held it up, his fingers moving with a speed that almost startled her. He was working on something, an escape plan, a way out, but she didn't know what it was. All she could do was watch and pray that it worked. The guards outside began to talk again, the sound of boots shuffling closer. The human stood up straight, his body poised, ready for anything. She didn't know what he had planned, but the fire in his eyes made her believe that he would get them out of this. He had to. Suddenly, the door jerked open, and the light outside poured into the room. The guards were right there. Everything happened in an instant. The human's device let out a low whine, and the room's lights flickered, dimming for just a moment. It was enough. In that split second of darkness, the human moved with a speed that was almost inhuman, pulling the girl to the side, ducking behind a stack of crates. The guards, confused by the sudden shift, hesitated for a moment, but that hesitation was all they needed. The human was already moving again, faster than the girl could track. He was a blur of motion, slipping behind the guards as they fumbled with their weapons, trying to reorient themselves. She could hear them yelling at each other, but the human was already taking them down, one by one. It was quick. It was efficient. And just like that, they were no longer a threat. The girl stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. In a matter of seconds, the human had turned the tide. He had taken out 2 armed guards without a sound, without hesitation. But there was no time to marvel at his skill. "Move," he hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her out of their hiding place. They were moving again, deeper into the maze of the facility, the sound of the guards' radios crackling in the distance, signaling that reinforcements were on their way. They didn't have much time. The human led her through a series of tight hallways, each turn feeling more desperate than the last. Every corner could be their last. Every door could be a trap. The air was thick with the tension of their flight, the sound of approaching soldiers, the distant roar of alarm systems. But the human never faltered. He was always one step ahead, always pushing forward, pulling her with him. Then they reached a door. It was hidden in a corner, almost indistinguishable from the rest of the walls. The human didn't hesitate. He pulled a small, modified keycard from his pocket and slid it through the scanner. There was a soft beep, and the door slid open, revealing a darkened room on the other side. "After you," the human said, his voice tight with urgency. The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the space beyond the door. Could she trust him? Was this really the way out? But the sound of footsteps grew louder, much louder. They didn't have time for doubts. She stepped forward, into the darkness, following him into whatever lay beyond. As the doors slid shut behind them, the human and the alien girl were plunged into total darkness. The room smelled stale, the air thick with the scent of rust and age. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on them, a silence that was both oppressive and comforting. At least they were hidden, for now. But even in the darkness, her senses were sharper than his. She could hear the faint hum of machinery, the distant buzz of the facility's failing power grid, and the subtle creak of the walls shifting. This place, whatever it was, felt like it was on the verge of collapse. Every sound was magnified, every shadow stretched into something ominous. She didn't like it. The human moved forward, reaching for something in his pack, but the girl held him back. Wait. He stopped, his head turning slightly to face her. What is it? Her mind raced. Something didn't feel right. The tension in the air was too thick. Her instincts were screaming at her to be cautious, but the human seemed unaware, his focus entirely on whatever lay ahead. She could feel the thrum of energy pulsing through the walls, almost as if the building itself was alive, watching them. Something's wrong, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. He paused, sensing her unease. What do you mean? Before she could respond, the room around them seemed to shift. The walls hummed louder. The air vibrated more intensely, and then without warning, the entire floor beneath them trembled. The ground shook violently, throwing them off balance. The girl instinctively reached out to steady herself, her heart pounding. The human's eyes went wide as he grabbed her arm, pulling her close. What the hell is happening? He muttered, his grip tight on her arm. The tremors grew stronger, almost as if the entire facility was about to implode. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was thicker, heavier, more foreboding. What was that? She asked, her voice strained with uncertainty. The human looked around, his brow furrowing. I don't know, but we need to keep moving. He didn't wait for her response. His feet shifted, and he began to move again, but the girl stayed frozen for a moment longer. Something in the pit of her stomach told her that the danger was far from over. She could feel a presence, a force, lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of her senses. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, navigating the maze-like corridors of the facility. It was clear that the human was doing his best to stay ahead of whatever had triggered the quake. His steps were fast, deliberate, but his eyes darted constantly. He didn't know this place as well as he let on. She could see that now. He was running on instinct, not knowledge. They reached another door, this one heavier than the last. The human placed his hand on the keypad, and, with a low beep, the door slid open. The room inside was darker than the last, the air cold and damp. The human stepped in first, his hand still gripping hers as he tugged her along. But as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening clang. The sound echoed in the empty space, and she turned to look at him, her expression tense. What is it? She asked, her voice low, trying to suppress the unease growing inside her. The human's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. It was a large, open space, seemingly unused. The walls were lined with large tanks of some kind of liquid, their contents a murky, unnatural green. At the far end of the room stood a control console, surrounded by flashing lights and screens that seemed to glitch in and out of focus. But that wasn't what caught their attention. It was the sound. A low, rumbling hum, followed by a voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Welcome, visitors," the voice said, its tone warm and eerily welcoming. "It's been a long time since we've had company." The human stiffened, his hand dropping to his side as he reached for something she didn't recognize. The girl could feel her pulse quicken, her senses on high alert. This was wrong. This entire situation was wrong. "You've been misled," the voice continued, now more clear, more distinct. "You weren't meant to find this place. But now that you have, I suppose it's only fair to introduce ourselves." The room seemed to pulse, the lights flickering and casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. Then the voice returned, this time with a note of menace. "Your journey ends here. You are not the first to seek what lies beyond these walls, and you certainly won't be the last. But you will not leave. None of you ever do." The air grew colder, the hum deepening, as if the walls themselves were alive, reacting to their presence. The human turned to her, his face grim, his voice low. "We've walked right into a trap." The girl's breath caught in her throat as realization struck. This wasn't just a hidden facility or an isolated part of the world. This was something far worse, a controlled environment. A place designed to trap those who stumbled upon it, to keep them from escaping. There was no way out. "Not now. Not anymore. We need to move," the human said again, but his voice was different now, less confident. There was an edge of fear in it, something she hadn't heard before. Something human. She saw it in his eyes, too, the way they darted around the room, trying to find a way out. The walls seemed to close in on them. The sound of the rumbling hum grew louder, the temperature dropping steadily, the air growing thick with tension. It was clear that the room was designed to contain them, to keep them trapped in this nightmare. And yet, they hadn't seen the worst of it yet, not by a long shot. A sudden hiss sounded from one of the tanks at the far end of the room. The girl's eyes snapped toward it, her heart leaping in her chest as the liquid within began to bubble and churn. Something inside the tank was moving. It was alive. Without warning, the tank cracked open, releasing a dark, viscous fluid into the room. The girl's breath hitched as the liquid began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, and then horrifyingly something began to emerge from the tank. A shape, dark and menacing, taking form as the liquid cascaded to the floor. The room was no longer just a trap. It was a prison. And they were not alone. "Get ready," the human said, his voice steely. "We have to fight." But even he didn't seem entirely sure that they could win. The shape in the tank continued to rise, taking on a terrifying humanoid form, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The girl's heart hammered in her chest as she prepared herself for what was to come. She knew that the stakes had just been raised beyond anything they had ever expected. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about escaping an enemy they didn't fully understand and fighting something far more dangerous than either of them had ever faced before. The creature emerging from the tank was something the girl had never seen before. Its form was both alien and grotesque, a twisted blend of humanoid features and something far darker. It was tall, easily twice the height of a human, with skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, a deep black that absorbed every flicker of illumination. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, bright red, cold, calculating, It moved with a fluidity that was both terrifying and inhuman, as if it existed in a reality separate from the one they were trapped in. And it was coming for them. The human didn't hesitate. His hand shot to his side, pulling a sleek weapon from his belt. He didn't say a word, but the determination in his eyes spoke volumes. The girl's heart was in her throat as she instinctively stepped back, but she couldn't let fear control her now. She had to fight. She had to help him. With a sharp motion, the human raised his weapon and fired. The shot rang out, a bright flash cutting through the room as the beam hit the creature square in the chest. It recoiled, but only for a second. It didn't seem to bleed, but its body distorted in a way that made it appear almost as if it were regenerating, the wound closing before their eyes. "Move!" the human yelled, grabbing her arm again and pulling her toward the far wall. The girl wasn't sure what to do. The creature was almost indestructible. Their weapons, their strength, it didn't matter. It was like they were fighting against something that wasn't even bound by the same laws of reality. They were cornered. The door they had entered through was shut tight, and there was no time to search for another exit. The creature moved toward them with terrifying speed, its massive arms reaching out, its glowing eyes locking onto them. The human raised his weapon again, but this time the girl stepped forward, her mind racing. She couldn't just stand there and watch him fight. She had powers, abilities that had kept her alive in this prison for so long. It was time to finally use them. "I've got this," she said, her voice firm, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. The human hesitated, looking at her with a mix of disbelief and concern, but he trusted her. He stepped aside, his weapon ready, but his eyes never left the creature. The girl focused, drawing from the energy deep within her powers she had honed since she was a child, powers that had kept her alive through the worst of it. She felt the pulse of the room, felt the hum of the machinery and the strange energy that filled the space. She focused it all, gathering it into her hands. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, as she unleashed a blast of energy straight toward the creature. It hit with a deafening crack, and the creature stumbled back, its glowing eyes wide with what almost looked like surprise. But it didn't stop. It wasn't enough. Her powers were strong, but the creature was something else entirely. Before they could react, the creature launched forward with a screech, its claws outstretched, reaching for the girl. Time seemed to slow as the human dived toward her, pushing her out of the way. But he wasn't fast enough. One of the creature's claws caught him in the side, and he let out a strangled cry of pain. Blood splattered the floor. "No!" The girl screamed, scrambling to his side. He gripped her hand with his own, his breathing shallow. "Get out of here," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "You have to leave. It's not safe." But she refused to leave him. Not now. Not when they were this close. With a roar, the girl surged forward, her powers flaring brighter than ever before. She released everything she had, every ounce of energy she could gather. The blast was so strong that the walls around them shook, the machinery in the room groaning in protest as it overloaded. The creature shrieked as the energy hit, its body writhing as if it were being torn apart from the inside. The human pushed himself up, his face pale but determined. He didn't say a word, but he nodded at her. They had to finish this, together. They launched into action, the human using his weapon to distract the creature as the girl focused everything on her next move. She reached out with her mind, manipulating the energy around them, pulling the machinery to life. The room seemed to pulse with her power, each connection coming to life with a sharp crackle of electricity. The machinery around the creature began to work against it, constricting, binding, trapping it within its own confines. The creature howled in fury, its form struggling against the confines of the room. With one final push, the girl unleashed a concentrated blast that struck the creature square on the chest, sending it crashing to the ground with a force that shook the entire room. For a moment, the room was still. Breathing heavily, the girl and the human watched, their bodies tense, waiting for any sign that the creature was still alive. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. But slowly, the creature's body began to dissolve into the air, its form turning to dust. It was over. The girl collapsed to her knees beside the human, exhaustion overwhelming her. She was alive. They were alive. But just as the feeling of victory began to settle in, the human's voice cut through the silence, a note of confusion creeping into it. "We're not alone," he said quietly. The girl blinked, her heart lurching as she looked up at him. She was too tired to comprehend what he was saying, but the human's gaze had shifted to the far corner of the room. Her eyes followed his, and there, standing in the shadows, was another figure. A woman, tall, regal, with eyes that glowed the same deep red as the creature they had just destroyed. The air around her crackled with power, the same kind of power the girl had felt before. The woman's lips curled into a smile, cold and knowing. "Well done," the woman said, her voice smooth and taunting. "You've survived the test, but the real game begins now." The human and the girl exchanged a look, their minds racing with questions they didn't know how to answer. The woman took a step forward, and the girl's stomach twisted in fear. She wasn't just any survivor. She was something far worse. And the fight, it seemed, was far from over. As the woman stepped out of the shadows, the air seemed to grow even colder. Her presence was like a dark storm cloud that smothered everything in its path. The girl could feel the power radiating off of her, raw, untamed, and ancient. The woman's eyes glowed with an eerie, familiar red light, and her smile was sharp, knowing. She had been waiting for them, and now that they had defeated the creature, she was going to make sure the next stage of the game was far more complex. The human and the girl exchanged a glance, both of them momentarily stunned. For a second, everything seemed to stop their breaths, the hum of the machinery, even the distant rumble that had started earlier. It was as if the world had held its breath. "You're still alive," the woman said, her voice soft but filled with an unshakable authority. "Impressive. But this is just the beginning. Who are you?" The human's voice cracked, his eyes narrowing as he stepped between the woman and the girl. He was hurt, exhausted, but he wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. "Not now. What do you want?" The woman's lips twitched into a faint smirk. "I've been watching you two for quite some time. You are more interesting than I initially thought. More resilient. But you still don't understand." "Not really." The girl stood up slowly, her knees sore and trembling, but she held her ground. She had never felt so conflicted. Part of her was terrified of this woman, this unknown enemy, but the other part, the part that had fought and survived this far, wasn't ready to give up. "Then explain," the girl demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. "What is this place? What's going on?" The woman's gaze turned toward her, and for a moment the girl thought she saw something akin to pity in her eyes. It was fleeting, gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," the woman replied. "But perhaps it's time for you to learn." With a sudden wave of her hand, the room shifted again. The walls groaned and shuddered. and the air seemed to thicken as the lights flickered on, revealing more of the room's true nature. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the once barren room suddenly came to life. Large tanks lined the walls, and the familiar hum from before returned, this time with a different tone, a darker, more menacing rhythm. The tanks weren't just storage containers. They were holding something. "Those are the others," the woman said, following the girl's gaze. "The ones who came before you. The ones who failed." The girl's heart sank as she moved closer to one of the tanks. Inside, she could see shapes, alien forms floating in the viscous liquid, their eyes wide open, their bodies twisted in agony. The creatures she had fought, the ones she had been trying to escape, they were all here, preserved, imprisoned, and waiting for something. Their bodies, their minds, all taken. The woman continued in an effort to break them, to test them, and ultimately use them. "And you're just like them." The words hit the girl like a punch to the gut. She had thought she was different, that she was fighting for something bigger than herself, but now it seemed that she had been nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. "I don't believe you," the human said, his voice low but filled with a newfound determination. "We're not like them." The woman chuckled, a soft, mocking sound that sent chills down the girl's spine. "You think you're special, that you're different. You have no idea who you're dealing with. This place, it isn't just a prison. It's a testing ground, a breeding ground for something far older than you could ever imagine." The girl felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. What was she saying? What was this place really? The truth was starting to sink in, and it was far more terrifying than she had ever imagined. "I think," the woman said slowly, "it's time for you to truly understand what you've stumbled upon. Welcome to the real test." Suddenly, the lights flickered and the air grew thicker, almost suffocating. The hum from the walls intensified, and the girl could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet. The creature they had destroyed earlier, its body still lay in a pile on the floor. But now it began to shift, its form reforming, its eyes opening once again. It was alive. "Get ready," the human said urgently, pulling the girl back toward the door they entered through. But before they could react, the woman raised her hand. "No," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You don't get to leave. Not yet. You haven't earned that." With a snap of her fingers, the room shifted again. The walls moved, closing them in. They were trapped. The girl could hear the sound of machinery whirring to life as the tanks began to glow with a sickly light. The figures inside the tanks were waking up. They were moving, stirring, their eyes flickering with life. "You will be tested," the woman said. "Your survival, your strength, everything you've done so far, it's nothing compared to what's coming next. You think you're the last ones left? You think you've won? There is no escape. You will be forced to face what you really are." The girl's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what this woman was, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the first figure in the tank stepped forward, the girl's eyes widened in shock. It was a being she recognized, a creature she had fought alongside, one of her own kind. But there was something wrong with it. Its eyes were clouded, its body disfigured, as though it had been twisted and corrupted. The creature let out a low, mournful wail, its voice like a plea for help. "This is what happens," the woman said coldly. "This is what happens to those who resist, who fail to understand their true purpose." "No," the girl whispered, her mind racing. This can't be real. The woman's smile widened. It is. And now you will fight. You will fight for your life. And you will see just how far you can go. The girl could feel the weight of the woman's words, each one like a chain tightening around her. She had to find a way out. They had to escape. But the power in the room was overwhelming. The walls were closing in. The tanks were now releasing the twisted, corrupted creatures that had once been her companions, and the human beside her was already preparing for the worst. "Are you ready?" the woman asked, stepping back into the shadows. The girl didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond. But she knew one thing: she wasn't going to give up. She wasn't going to let this place break her, not like it had broken so many others. With a deep breath, she turned to the human beside her, her voice fierce. "We can still win this. We have to." They were outnumbered. They were outmatched. But they weren't going to back down. Not now. Not when they had come so far. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the first of the corrupted creatures lunged toward them, the girl pushed forward, her power surging again. She had nothing left to lose. It was do or die. She would fight until her last breath, until every chain that bound her was broken, until every question was answered. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way out of this nightmare together.